Welcome to prayer meeting. We have a new environment today. It's our morning Bible study room. The opening hymn for tonight's prayer meeting is 389. Teach me thy way, O Lord. Teach me thy way, O Lord. Teach me thy way, O Lord, teach me thy way, thy guiding grace, Lord, teach me thy way, help me to walk aright, more by faith, less by sight. Lead me with heavenly light, teach me thy way. When I am sad at heart, teach me thy way. When earthly joys depart, teach me thy way. In hours of loneliness, in times of dire distress, in failure or success, teach me thy way. When doubts and fears arise, teach me thy way. When storms so spread the skies, teach me thy way. Shine through the cloud and rain, through sorrow, toil, and pain. Make thou thy pathway plain, teach me thy way. Long as my life shall last, teach me thy way. Where my Lord is cast, teach me thy way. Until the race is run, until the journey's done, until the crown is won, teach me thy way. Amen. Next hymn is 542, 542, Saved by Grace. 542. Someday the silver cord will break, and I no more as now shall sing, but oh the joy when I shall wake within the palace of the King, and I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace, and I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace. Someday my earthly house shall fall, I cannot tell how soon will be, but this I know, my all in all has now a place in heaven for me, and I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace, and I shall see him face to face and tell the story saved by grace. Someday when fades the golden sun,
face and tell the story saved by grace. Someday till then, I'll watch and wait, my lamp all trim and burning bright, that when my Savior opens the gate, my soul to Him may take its flight, and I shall see Him face to face and tell the story saved by grace. When I shall see Him face to face and tell the story saved by grace.
Let us pray. Father in heaven, we want to thank Thee for this night of prayer. Thank Thee for gathering us. Thank Thee for this room that is made available for a prayer meeting. O Lord, may Thou come by Thy Spirit to fill us and bless our time here as we study Thy word, as we look to Thee in prayer. May Thy blessing be outpoured upon Thy people. This I pray in thanksgiving. Through Jesus' name, amen. Our final hymn is 539, Beyond the Sunset. 539, Beyond the Sunset. Beyond the sunset,
O blissful morning, when with our Savior hath His begun, thus toiling ended, O glorious dawning, beyond the sunset, when day is done. Beyond the sunset, no doubts will get. On that fair shore, beyond the sunset, oh glad reunion with our dear loved ones who've gone before. In that fair homeland, we'll know no parting. Beyond the sunset, forevermore.
Amen. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 to 4. We shall be just considering the first two verses tonight, but we shall be reading the first four verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 7. and the day of death better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For it is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Amen. We continue our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. We are now at the halfway mark, and Solomon will now show us the wisdom that God has showered upon him from on high. Up to now, he has been dwelling on life under the sun. And as we saw last week, how it is all vanity. Truly vanity under the sun. That was what we observed as we closed last week's exhortation. But today, he brings us to a visual service, to a funeral scene, as he begins to instruct us concerning wisdom of life, the wisdom of life. I've entitled this devotion, Lessons in the House of Mourning, Part 1, taken from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 to 4. As we continue our series of these messages, remember now thy Creator. We shall be looking at the first two verses. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to the heart. We celebrate the beginning of life when a child is born. When you look at a young baby that is tender and just out of the mother's womb, you can observe how the child is so dependent upon the parents in the initial years. The parents hold the responsibility of nurturing the child to maturity. And the child, when he grows up, begins his own family, and his children comes, and perhaps by reason of strength, he sees also his grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. And then the end draws near, and one day we will be notified to be at the house of mourning, to remember the departed. This morning, we were studying the life of Jacob. Jacob's life in his last hours. He was in Egypt, and in the land of Goshen. He has lived 17 years there, and that was the close of his life. Jacob lived to a ripe old age of 147 years old. And we saw how he lived to see his beloved son Joseph in Egypt, and was under the care of Joseph in those latter days that brought to Jacob much comfort to his heart. But most of all, he was concerned that he has passed on the covenant blessings of God to his posterity. That was his chief concern. The last 3 chapters of Genesis were devoted to Jacob's blessings for his children and grandchildren. We saw how for Jacob, his primary concern when he was at the last moments of his life was his final resting place. he gave specific instructions to Joseph to make sure that he will be buried in Canaan, and that he will be buried in the tomb place of his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. And he gave instructions to Joseph and asked Joseph to make an oath to fulfill his last wish to be buried in Canaan. And these are the last words that we saw of Jacob's life in Genesis 49, verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it, that their fathers spake unto them and blessed them, every one according to his blessing he blessed them. And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite, for a possession of a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. Leah was buried there, in that same burial site. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And so he recited all these details. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people. And it was described in Genesis 50 how the children and family mourn for the departing of their father. Solomon, in his study of the book of Ecclesiastes, now in the second part, brings us to this death scene, to the end of a person's life. And he wants us to think, as we are going through that journey of life, that we would reach that ultimate last day, last hour, as in Jacob's life. And he would want us to think about that end point, as it were, in our earthly sojourn. Because what we do now does impact what our life will be at the end. And you would notice that from now on, instead of using a narrative style of writing, Solomon would be using a lot of poetical expression, Hebrew poetical expression of similar thoughts, contrasting thoughts, comparative thoughts, as he did when he wrote the book of Proverbs. We know that the book of Proverbs was written in his younger days, and the book of Ecclesiastes was written in his latter days. And when he wrote the book of Proverbs, he was delineating the wisdom that God gave him on high. And now in the second half of this book, he would be awakened to heavenly wisdom, and he would want now to remind us how life ought to be lived. And he would tell us that God wants you to live with heavenly wisdom. So we have these 4 good thoughts, which we will take 2 today. A good name, verse 1, better than house of feasting. Well, what we are saying here is from our title, Lessons from the House of Mourning. So, a good name, better, how the house of mourning is better than the house of feasting. And how when you are in the house of mourning, God give you a better countenance and heart. And finally, the house of mourning is a place for the wise of heart. And so, we want us to consider this first thought that he wants to express to us. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. At the end of a person's life, such a life can be evaluated by the living and assessed. Right? At the end of a person's life, you can see, right, what was in his life. You could see the passing scenes. You might have known the person for a period of time, and you would see how he lived his life throughout his earthly sojourn. And now he is in his final resting place. And Solomon is telling us that the end of life is better than the beginning of life. He's telling us that there is that end point. And he's saying to us that there is that glorious end point that the people of God ought to be looking forward to. The Apostle Paul said the same thing as Solomon. He says, for me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He says that if I die, I rest from my labor. When I die, I have completed my life's journey. The things that God has given for me to do, I have done it. So he says that to be with the Lord, for him, is far better. Because he would, when he reached heaven, enjoy the fruit of a godly life. And that's what John wrote in the book of Revelation, Revelation 14 verse 3. As he looked at the dead, the blessing is pronounced upon the dead. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, that they may rest from their labors and their works do follow them. You know, as a child of God, the things that you do have eternal impact. And the good that you do, God sees and God rewards you in eternity. So the good works that you do follow you, in the sense that you would be holding and enjoying the fruit of the good work that you have done in this earthly life. So he's trying to lead us to think how we ought to live our life before we reach the end point. We are all in that journey, as we said last week. When you go to a cemetery, you see the dead buried there, you see the beginning date, and you see the ending date. The beginning date, the date of a person's birth, and you see the ending date, the last date. We are all in that in-between date, right? And we are all moving towards that end point. We don't know when it will be, but it will come, right? The end is certain for each one of us. But the Lord wants us to know, right, that there's a way to live. Solomon wants us to know there is a way to live. So he said in Proverbs 10 verse 7, the memory of the just is blessed, or is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. He tells us that, you know, as we live, we are to take care of our testimony. He wants us basically to live with a good conscience through life. You know, when we live with a bad conscience, when we live against the will of God, when we live sinning against God, we don't have a good sleep in the night. And when we think and consider what Solomon is saying here, that we are to have a good name, here he's saying to us that we are to consider what reputation do we have at the end of our life. And so this text in verse 1 can be translated like that, literally, in the first part. Good name from perfume good. Or basically, he's saying here, right, a good name is better than precious ointment. But in order to emphasize the word good, it is placed in the beginning of the sentence and in the end of the sentence. And in between is the word name and the word ointment. Right? And it's interesting that the word for name is the word shem, and the word for ointment is the word shaman. Right? And you would see how there is in sound, right, it is quite similar. All right, and it begins with the word good and ends with the word good. It is to provoke the people, just like in English when we write in poetry, it rhymes. Okay, so these words here, if you read it in Hebrew, it rhymes. Okay, and so it is to jot them to think, to consider how their life ought to be fragrant, how they are to live that life that is as the best perfume. Okay, and he tells us, he compares, he says that this life that we have, okay, is best evaluated at the end of it. The good fragrance of a person's life is better appreciated at the end than at his birth. And so the Lord wants us to think that, as we go through life, to think about how we are living our life. Is it a life that brings honor, that brings glory to God? Are we pursuing those things in our life that at the end of our life's journey, we are going to say, no regrets. This is what God would want me to do, and this is how I have lived. And so as you think about this good reputation, this good name, we want us to think inwardly about a good conscience, living with a good conscience. So that, if our conscience does not rebuke us, all right, it means that, we know in a certain way, in self-evaluation, that we have lived a life that we believe is pleasing to the Lord. So when Solomon is writing this, he's targeting the readers. He's targeting us. He's saying to us that we are to think about how we ought to live our lives and how we are living our life. Evaluate it, because there is going to be an end point. And when it comes to the end of a person's life, well, we think and consider what went on in that person's life. So you can be a father, you can be a mother, you can be a grandfather, a grandmother, you can be a friend, you can be a colleague to the people around you. The Lord wants you to think, where you are going, what you are doing with your life. Right? And there was the hymn, for all the saints who rest who from their labors rest, that describe the end journey of the life of the people of God. How it's such a wonderful time of rest, how it's such a wonderful time where you know that you have completed your life's journey and that you are ready to go, you are at peace. You are at peace. And the Lord wants us to look forward and work towards such a life, such an end, right? Whereby you know that in your heart there is no regrets. So He wants us to think, and He wants us to consider how we should live, how our life ought to be fragrant, how our lives ought to impact the lives of the people around us. And you see, as you evaluate and think about the lives of men and women who have gone before us, you see different people. Some would leave this world contented, happy, satisfied, because they know that they have completed their race. But there are those who struggle because somehow there is that unfulfilled desire in the heart. There's something that is causing them not to have that peace of heart. But Solomon is saying to us, right, that we want to arrive there well. And therefore, we are to consider how we are to live that life. And in order to help us better prepare ourselves, right, for our ultimate end. And if you go to the cemetery, you'll find that not every tombstone consists of people who are old. Many of the tombstones you would see consist of people who died young. You see. And so do not think that you will not reach the end point because you are young. Right? But we are all to take stock. And how can we take stock? Well, he tells us in verse 2, better the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Go to the house of mourning. Go and attend a vigil service, attend a funeral. Right? Most people don't want to go to a funeral, don't want to go to a vigil service. Very sad time. They said some would say bad luck. Don't want to go. But Solomon is saying to us that we as God's children, as men and women who are living above the sun, we ought to, as God would lead us. Jesus, while he was on earth, go to the house of feasting. Likewise, he goes to the house of mourning. Remember when he began his ministry, he went to a wedding. Right? He did his first miracle at Cana of Galilee. How he was there to celebrate together with the family, the couple who are coming together as husband and wife. But you also see him in the house of mourning. He was there in the house in Bethany together with Mary and Martha. Because Lazarus, the brother, whom Jesus visited often, whenever he comes en route to Jerusalem, he would drop by Bethany, and he would be received with hospitality by the family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But one day Lazarus, the brother, died. And he died, literally died. And so the family was very sad. They went and called for Jesus to come. And Jesus came. And when you study the text in John chapter 11, you will see he was 4 days late. And the body started to rot already. But Jesus, when he came, he wrought a miracle. Right? Lazarus was resurrected from the dead. But before that, you see how Jesus wept. How Jesus wept. Jesus was there to comfort the family. He was there with the family. So we are not saying that you don't go to the house of feasting because here the text tells us that it's better to go to the house of mourning. But what we are saying here is that, you know, when there is someone you know, someone in the family of God's church with a departed loved one, do not hesitate to go and encourage the family. Do not hesitate to go and be with the family during this time of mourning, because you would learn precious lessons in the house of mourning. So Solomon is saying, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. And he tells us the reason. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to heart. You see? Because you know that you are going to reach that end point. And therefore, you would think, all right, concerning these things. And at the house of mourning, we see the end of life. We see the end of a man's life. And it is also in the house of mourning that we see the ultimate reality that after death is judgment. You see, after death is judgment. For it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. And it is those sobering times when it makes us think and consider about the things of eternal life, and help us to think about what are the things that we hold dear in our life, and evaluate the value system that we hold in this life. And if you look at what Solomon is saying to us, he's telling us to go to the house of mourning and find there in the house of mourning that man has to go through that moment of darkness. I received a tract this week, a tract that gives a testimony of someone who wrote because he has experienced, or he has, in a way, have the opportunity to understand and see what hell is like. And he's writing in order to tell us that, you know, hell is a frightening place. And the Bible gives us example of the man, the rich man who died and ended up in hell, and how he's so tormented, and how, you know, he has memory of the past, and he also has now present memory of his misery, and how he just simply cannot get out. And the tract was in English as well as in Mandarin. And I am trying to prepare it to give to some loved one to share with them concerning the eventuality of a coming judgment. And so Solomon, in his speaking here, is saying to us that when we go to the house of mourning, it is a sobering wake-up call for some. And he wants us to think about this so that life does not overtake us to a point of ultimate regret, without us having to be able to take stock of it before it's too late. So from now on, you'll be able to see how Solomon would give to us couplets after couplets, line after line of godly wisdom, how we ought to live our lives. And after he tells us about the misery of a life without God, now he tells us the blessing of a life with God. And he would describe to us and show us how we can take hold of this good life with God. And he begins at the end of life in a visual service, and he tells us, consider that we are to have a good conscience at the end as we live life, that our conscience does not rebuke us, that we have lived life according as what God would want us to. In other words, we have made right with God. May the Lord help us, guide us,